So we're glad that you guys are here. We're in this, I want to just address this. We're in this huge, gigantic room because we are recording this, and this is the best room, the best place for this to be recorded. So I also want you to keep that in mind at the end for the Q&A portion that we have. If you don't want to ask the question, you don't want to be on the recording, then please feel free to write it down and I'll ask the question. I won't say your name. I won't be like Lauren Jones wants to know. So, anyway, feel free to write your question down, give it to a friend, give it to me, and we'll make sure to ask the question. The Q&A time at the very end is really, really valuable because I can guarantee if you have a question, your question is also on the mind of somebody else's. So if you have never been to one of our parent talks, I want to welcome you. And if you're new to Oak Hills Church, I want to welcome you as well. This is kind of how this will run tonight. We have parent talks 3 times a year. And the parent talks are topical. They're usually something that is going on in our culture. Our families have questions around it. And we bring in, I believe, the best of the best to talk about the specific topics. So Dr. Jeff Henderson will be with us tonight, and I'll talk about him in just a few minutes. But he will get up and talk about our mental health in our children, what the Bible says about that from his perspective as a pediatrician and also with years of experience working with teenagers and children, obviously. He'll give us a lot of great information on that. And then at the end, as he wraps up, I mentioned the Q&A time. We will have an open Q&A, and this is where you can ask him anything that you want to ask him. A lot of times you can listen to a talk like this on a podcast or on a YouTube video or something, but what's valuable is that you don't always get to ask the expert themselves certain questions. So again, don't hold back. Whatever question you have, if you don't want to ask it out loud because of the recording, then write it down, give it to me, and we can ask. But we will be wrapping up at 6 o'clock, so if you've got children that you need to pick up downstairs, you'll have time to do that. But we'll still be sticking around if you have some more questions or you just didn't want to ask in public. But remember, if you have a question, probably someone else does as well. And we want you to be ministered to today. So as you're here, just receive. Everything we want to share is with you in mind and with your children in mind and for your relationship with your children to be strengthened through this. You guys are the primary spiritual influence in your child's life. And even though sometimes it doesn't feel like it, you see no fruit, but you are. They are listening. Like I said, even when it doesn't seem like they're listening, they are. We are for you. You are number one in your child's life. The church just comes alongside you. So you are the expert in your child's life. Nobody else is. The mom, the dad, you guys, the ones who are raising their children, you're the expert in your child's life. So we want to just encourage you in that and come alongside you as best we can. So let me tell you a little bit about Jeff. He is an elder here at Oak Hills Church, but he's also a pediatrician, and I'm just going to read a few things that, along with being a pediatrician, what also gives him some really great credibility to be teaching on this is he's certified in suicide risk assessment and prevention by the QPR Institute. He's trained in clinical hypnosis by the American Society of Clinical Hypnosis. He's certified in sexual assault forensics examination by the U.S. Army. And also, on top of that, he has served here. Jeff, I'm just going to call you out. How many years?
I'm 20.
20 years with the student ministry and teaching classes. They hold a D group or a Bible study in their home, he and his wife Sarah. So they have lots of experience with teenagers and lots of experience with this topic. They also have 2 college students, Amelia, who is at ACU, and Teddy, who is at
U of H.
University of Houston. So anyway, let me pray, and then I will hand it over to Jeff. Lord, thank you so much for the knowledge that you give us, the ways to understand our children. Lord, would you open up our hearts and open up our minds to understand clearly what you have to say to us about our children, about their mental health, God. Lord, would you be with Jeff as he shares this message, God. And Lord, would you minister to the hearts of the parents in this room? Would they walk away encouraged and with hope? Lord, not with fear. You are not the author of fear, but God, your plan is for us to have a life full of hope. So God, today would you impress that on our hearts and on our minds? And we love you so much in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. I guess I should clarify. When you asked me how many years, I wasn't sure exactly what the question was. I think we've been working with teenagers for over 20 years. We've been at Oak Hills for about 20 years. I don't think we haven't been working with teenagers at Oak Hills. It's probably closer to half that. So sorry, didn't mean to mislead you right off the bat. We're going to be covering a lot of ground tonight. All right, even to just give a cursory overview of a topic this big is going to take some time, and we're going to try to hit on several different topics. And if you're anything like me, over the course of the evening, you're going to tune in and tune out. There are times listening to sermons that I go off in my own little mind and I follow rabbit trails and all of that stuff, and that's totally okay. But in order to facilitate that, I wanted to give you the main point just right up front. Okay, so if you don't take anything else from this evening, please just take this one thing. We're just going to front load right here. Take this phrase, I love you no matter what. I love you no matter what. If you ever get stuck as a parent, if you're not sure what to do, you're not sure how to respond, you're not sure what to say, you don't know whether to hug your child or strangle them, go to that phrase. I love you no matter what. Practice it. Repeat it to yourself in the mirror every morning. Stick it in your pocket, and anytime you don't know what to do, you pull that out and you say, I love you no matter what. You may now be excused. That's all you really need to know. But if you want to stick around, like I said, we're going to hit on several different topics. We've got a lot of ground to cover. But I hope to encourage you simply by saying that no matter what you're going through, no matter what you're dealing with personally or with your children or as a family, there is nothing new under the sun. No matter what you're dealing with, someone has probably dealt with something similar before. And we have counselors, psychologists, pastors, physicians who have helped others like you. There's nothing new under the sun. And yet, even if your specific situation, even if that's unheard of, we've never experienced anything like it before, you still have yet to surprise God. I believe, and I'm encouraged that the stigma around mental health is changing. That's a good thing. But I think we still find it difficult to ask for help when we need it. Know that you're not alone. You're not alone in this. At least you don't have to be alone. You can certainly choose to be alone, but you don't have to forge a new trail. You don't have to just figure it out for yourself. There's a host of fine men and women who have dedicated their professional lives to helping people like you and families like yours. So don't try to do this alone. We're meant to be a community of burden sharers. Also, as we proceed through these topics, try not to tune out just because your child isn't currently depressed, or just because you haven't personally dealt with gender identity issues. I think that any of these topics that don't live under your roof, they absolutely live in your neighborhood, and they absolutely reside in our church. Your children are not as sheltered as you think. Now, many of you, your eyes have already been open to that, but let me just disabuse you of any notion that your children are sheltered, okay? Even homeschoolers deal with gender identity issues. Even children in private Christian schools are going to deal with anxiety issues. Every child with internet access, every child with a smartphone, every child with access to social media, they're going to be affected and they're going to be engaged in the conversations about these topics. And so if those conversations are already happening in their digital world, they also need to be happening in real life at our dinner table. These are conversations that we need to be having with our children for two reasons. First of all, to support our children, but second of all, to prepare them and equip them to support their peers and their friends. Let's start with stress. We're parenting a generation of children who are stressed. We're parenting a generation of students who are stressed. These students are not any more stressed than any generation before them. I want to say that again. I do not believe that our children are any more stressed than any generation before them. The average 8th grader is what, like 14 years old and in middle school taking algebra, and you're like, whoa, algebra in middle school, that's huge, that's enormously stressful. But go back in history, and it used to be that a 14-year-old was trying to make an arranged marriage work. And we're going to compare that to algebra? Right? They were trying to figure out how to learn to love their spouse and how to have a family. I mean, come on. Our 16-year-olds, they're taking college-level AP courses. And I get it. That's a big deal, right? That's stressful. That's difficult. But is it any more stressful than having to leave school and go work the farm because Pa died? Right? I don't believe that this generation is any more dealing with any more stress than any generation before them. The average 18-year-old is going off to college. They're not going off to war. They're not going off to kill a lion. They're not going off to settle the Western territories. But this generation may be less prepared to deal with stress than any generation in history. Stress is not bad. Stress isn't bad. Stress has pushed me to do some of my best work. Stress moves us to finish before the deadline. Stress forces us to slam on the brakes in order to avoid the accident. Stress makes us finally open up the laptop and start working on that project, on that assignment that we'd been avoiding. Stress is a noxious signal. It's a noxious signal to our body and to our mind, kind of like pain. And it's neither good nor bad. Now, a lot of people think that pain is bad. It's not. Pain is not bad. Ask anyone who has lost feeling or sensation, and they will remind you that pain is a noxious gift. Pain helps us pull our hand away from the stove. It tells us to pull the splinter out of our foot. Pain tells us maybe we should go to the emergency room to get that appendicitis looked at. Pain is noxious, no doubt, but it's a noxious gift. And so is stress. Stress is a noxious gift that makes our heart race, and it sends extra blood to our muscles, and it helps us jump out of the way when that car is bearing down on us in the crosswalk and isn't braking, right? Stress is that uncomfortable feeling that reminds us that we need to set aside time to study for that test that's looming over us. One of the great secrets about stress is that it actually gets worse with time. It gets worse with age, right? High school is more stressful than middle school. College is more stressful than high school. Having a job is more stressful than being a student. Being a parent is more stressful than being a child. Can I get an amen on that one at least? Okay, right? The thing is, as we proceed through life tends to become more stressful, and yet, for most of us, life actually gets better, despite the increase in stress, because we're learning how to manage that stress. We learn how to deal with it. We learn how to diffuse it, how to release it, how to recover from it. I recently saw the analogy of stress being kind of like a glass of water. That it doesn't really matter if it's a 12-ounce glass or a 16 or a 20-ounce glass. The amount of water, the weight, the amount of stress isn't what's actually the important factor. I've never looked at a 20-ounce glass and said, whoa, I can't do that. I can't handle anything over a pint. You go up to 20 ounces, that's my limit, right? I've never looked at that and said I can't deal with it, because there's not really that much difference between a 16-ounce glass and a 20-ounce glass, and we are perfectly equipped to drink out of any normal glass, right? What do? Well, we pick it up, we take a sip, we put it down, no problem. But what if? What if I had to hold on to that glass longer? What if I took a sip but didn't put it down right away? Well, after a while, it starts to become uncomfortable. If I were to do this for an hour, it starts to become really annoying. Even if it was only 8 ounces, it would really start to drive me crazy, right? Your hand starts to shake, your arm, it starts to ache, and it's honestly, it's difficult to do other things because I'm holding on to this glass of water. What if it wasn't just an hour? What if it was a few hours? What if it was all day? What if we continue holding on to it? Then eventually this little thing becomes life-consuming. Your arm goes numb. Your thoughts are preoccupied with this noxious thing. Your thoughts are preoccupied with this debilitating, paralyzing condition because you're still holding on to the glass. At some point, you just have to put it down. At some point, you have to put the glass down, and that's how stress works too. The negative effects of stress are due to the fatigue of holding on, not putting it down, not setting it aside. We let stress take over as the problem instead of just informing us that there is a problem. We let stress take over as the problem instead of it just informing us that there may be a problem. Now, there are certainly some stressors that we need to avoid, that we need to diminish, right? There are some stressors like bullying. We need to eradicate bullying. We need to keep social media to a minimum. And maybe your child isn't ready for AP courses just yet. Maybe your child isn't ready for club volleyball just yet. Maybe we need to diminish some of those stressors. There are some stressors that need to be avoided, but mostly we need to teach our children how to deal with stress. We need to teach them stress management. We need to teach them how to put down the glass of water. We need to teach them how to breathe, how to slow down, how to release tension, how to recreate. If you don't know how to manage stress, you need to learn. If you don't know how to manage stress, then how are you going to teach your children? I Googled stress management. Got 585 million hits in less than 1 second. Okay, stress is real, but so are the tools to manage it. The stress is real, but it's not unprecedented. Y'all remember when the COVID pandemic just started and we kept hearing about how it was unprecedented, that nothing like COVID had ever happened in the entire history of humanity? It was unprecedented was the word they kept using over and over again. Nothing like it had ever happened except for, the influenza epidemic of 1918 that lasted for about 2-3 years. Oh, and smallpox, which happened to kill about 30% of its victims. And, there was that Black Plague that killed half of the European population, right? COVID is real and it's dangerous, but it's not unprecedented. Stress is real, but it's not unprecedented. Stress is real, but it's not that we're dealing with an epidemic of stress, but simply a generation that's unprepared, uninformed, a generation in need of education and training. Not an epidemic of stress, but an epidemic of people unable to manage that stress. For those of you who checked your children into Bible Land, or Bible Buddies, I guess is what it is tonight. For those of you who checked your children in, you should know that they are learning about stress management right now. They're learning that life doesn't always go the way you want it to. That sometimes there are disappointments and unmet expectations, but that God has equipped us with everything we need to deal with those disappointments. They're practicing coping skills like breathing, actively engaging the imagination. They're learning how to pray for themselves directly to God. They're learning that they're part of a team. They're not alone. They're part of a team that includes you as parents and us as a body of believers, a team of church members and teachers and fellow classmates and even God himself. After you pick them up, talk to them about what they learned and then reinforce that. We are parenting a generation of students who are stressed, but for many, for an increasing number, it goes well beyond stress. Depression and anxiety are clearly on the rise for teenagers. 1 in 6 students will suffer from depression. That number is really conservative. It's probably closer to 1 in 5. 1 in 4 will struggle with anxiety. That number's probably closer to 1 in 3. 60% of those will not get any help. Let me say that again. Between 2.5 and 3 million adolescents in the United States are currently struggling with mental illness and are not receiving any help. Only 20% will actually discuss this with a health care provider. And you know what? Maybe some of the reason that they're not getting any help is because we're not real sure how to help. Our understanding of psychiatric illness and its chemical management is still very primitive. We're only a few generations removed from bloodletting and asylum care, right? We're getting better. We're getting better, but even now, we mostly focus on treating the symptoms. It's kind of like giving aspirin to someone who has pneumonia. It's a nice thing to do. It's palliative, it's helpful, but the underlying problem is more complicated than just managing a symptom. Our understanding of psychiatric care, as I said, is improving. Our management now is better than it used to be, but we still have a long way to go. But maybe part of the reason we're not getting help is because we're not real sure what to do. I even find it difficult just to define terms like anxiety and depression. How do you differentiate a diagnosis from just a personality trait? How do you differentiate between a mental illness and just the normal range of human experience? What's the difference between being stressed or stressed out and having anxiety or an anxiety disorder or just being an anxious person? Well, here's my best attempt to offer some definitions. Do with them what you will. But depression is not necessarily sadness. I think a lot of people equate depression and sadness, but depression is an emotional exhaustion or a mental fatigue about the inability to cope in your present circumstance. It's not a lack of desire, but an overwhelming and oppressive inability to deal with your current state, your current position. Anxiety is an emotional projection about the inability to cope in a future situation. So anxiety is actually, if you think about it, it's a negative exercise of the imagination. It's about an uncertain future, while depression impacts more the present. With depression, you say, I know that I should get out of bed, but I just can't. And notice the use of the word can't. There's no snap out of it. There's no look on the bright side. There's no just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. No one wants to snap out of it more than someone who is depressed. But they can't. They just simply cannot. They know that they should study. They know that they should exercise. They know that they should go to sleep. They know that they should get out of bed. They know that they should engage, that they should care, that they should look on the bright side, but they just can't. Depression is like emotional bankruptcy, right? You want to pay the bills. It's not a lack of desire, but you have insufficient funds. You have inadequate reserve. Depression cannot cope, whereas anxiety is the fear of a future inability to cope. That fear is usually linked to past experiences of poor coping. I consider these to kind of be two sides of the same coin, depression and anxiety. So I'm going to ask your forgiveness if I use them interchangeably at times. I should also mention that these are just intended to be kind of working definitions for the purposes of our conversation. These are not like the clinical criteria. These definitions are not meant to diagnose anyone. They're just intended to give some insight. In fact, I had a number of people kind of review my notes, and one of them said that their anxiety was actually linked to the past, and he or she was kind of disagreeing with me. Well, it turns out that person had PTSD, which is not just your typical run-of-the-mill anxiety. So again, these definitions, if they're helpful, that's great, but if not, that's fine. Don't get hung up on them. I'm not the final authority. I'm not the final authority on any of these matters. I'll ask for forgiveness regarding my own ignorance in all of this. I'm not the most qualified healthcare professional to be having this conversation, and I'm not the most qualified theologian to be having this conversation. But I live my life daily at an intersection of science and religion. And I see a beautiful God who is working graciously in his creation. And while our understanding is incomplete, and while I have personal ignorance in the matter, and perhaps our current treatments are going to cycle out of favor one day, we can at least agree that we need to be discussing these issues. And so that's why I'm here, and that's why you're here, with our knowledge and our ignorance, and we're going to try it simply because it needs to be discussed and because it's not anything new. These problems have been around since antiquity. Look at Psalm 13. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart all the day? How long will my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Enlighten my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death, and my enemy will say, I've overcome him. David, he had sorrow. He had sorrow in his heart all the day. Notice he talks about his enemy. Who is the enemy? What was the enemy? Was it Saul? Or was it Philistines? Or was it loneliness? Or sorrow? Or unmet expectations? Or was it distance from God? As he says, will you forget me forever? If he doesn't hear from God, then he will sleep the sleep of death. Does that mean he's suicidal? Is this an outcry? You read this psalm and it could easily be the poetry of a teenager who's cutting, who's engaged in self-harm, or who's suicidal. Lamentations 3. I have become a laughingstock to all my people. Their mocking song all the day. He has filled me with bitterness. He's made me drunk with wormwood. He has broken my teeth with gravel. He's made me cower in the dust. My soul, it's been rejected from peace. I have forgotten happiness. So I say, my strength has perished. My strength has perished, and so is my hope from the Lord. Jeremiah, he was rejected. He was an outcast. He was a laughing stock. He's getting bullied. He's filled with bitterness. Specifically, he says that God has filled him with bitterness. His mind, which here he calls his soul, he cannot find peace. He's completely forgotten happiness. He is without strength and without hope. 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Oh, for we do not want you to be unaware, brethren, of our affliction, which came to us in Asia, that we were burdened excessively burdened excessively beyond our strength, so that we despaired even of life. Indeed, we had the sentence of death within ourselves, so that we would not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead, who delivered us from so great a peril of death, and will deliver us, he on whom we have set our hope. Paul and his companions here, they were burdened beyond their strength. So in those past circumstances, they despaired even of life. They said they had the sentence of death within them. There's this misconception, this false narrative, that God will never give us more than we can bear. That is not true. 1 Corinthians 10:13 says that we will not be tempted beyond what we can bear. However, there seems to be no limit to the potential afflictions, not temptations, but afflictions, hardships that he allows to befall some of his favorites. I think that God specifically gives us more than we can bear so that we despair of self-reliance, so that we denounce independence, and so that we declare that we can only hope in God and God alone. I think God specifically gives us burdens we cannot bear so that we learn to share those burdens with God and within the community of believers. So Paul writes that they were excessively burdened beyond our strength, so that we would not trust in ourselves, but in God and his strength. Our experiences may be difficult, but they are not unprecedented. Paul was excessively burdened and despaired even of life. Elijah felt alone and wished for death in 1 Kings 19. Job didn't understand what was happening to him, and he turned to self-harm, cutting himself with shards of pottery in Job chapter 2. Jeremiah lost all hope and couldn't even remember happiness. David felt overcome and defeated by sorrow. In Psalm 42, David writes, "My tears have been my food day and night." My tears have been my food day and night. And we haven't even talked about Samson. Y'all remember Samson? I remember Samson. We learned about Samson, like in Bible class whenever I was little. We even talked about how Samson died. Anybody remember how he died? Suicide. Specifically, murder-suicide. Now, we're going to cut him a little bit of slack because it was a sanctioned killing, all right? The people that he killed were enemies of God, and this was Old Testament stuff, so we're going to cut him a little bit of slack there. But I think it's worth mentioning that a man who took his own life is regarded as a hero of the faith and is mentioned right alongside people like Moses and David and Samuel in Hebrews chapter 11. I do not want it to appear that I'm glorifying suicide, but I do think that we need to stop talking about it as some damnable sin. We should also mention that Samson wasn't a great role model for a lot of other reasons as well. That I don't remember them covering so much in Bible class. But what do we learn from this? Okay, what do we learn from all this? That there's nothing new under the sun. And that a lack of mental health does not make us irredeemable. A lack of mental health does not make us irredeemable. David, he found hope. God gave Elijah more work to do. Job was restored and he lived a long life enjoying his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren. Paul continued to preach the good news, the gospel of the kingdom of heaven, bringing hope to 100 generations through his writings. So mental illness does not make us irredeemable, but does it make us bad Christians? You know what I mean when I say bad Christians, right? Let me ask it a different way. Can a Christian, a true believer, have anxiety? Philippians 4 says, be anxious for nothing. Can a Christian have anxiety? Matthew 6:34 says, don't worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will care for itself. Can a Christian have anxiety? Can a good Christian have anxiety? Can a Christian have depression? If a Christian has depression, does it mean that they just haven't prayed enough? Does it mean that they've turned their backs on God or that they lack the faith? James, he writes, consider it pure joy when you face trials. Even though we just read where Paul said when he faced trials, he despaired of his life. Can a Christian have anxiety? Can a Christian have depression? Let me rephrase it. Ask the question again. Can a person have anxiety or depression and still have joy? Can depression and joy coexist in the same person at the same time? I think so. I sure hope so. Because depression is a circumstance and joy is not circumstantial. In fact, depression is often a pretty accurate representation or evaluation of our physical circumstance. This world is broken, people. It is broken and we're stuck here in the brokenness and all. Paul writes that all creation is groaning as though in childbirth. Negative emotions, depressed feelings, these are a necessary part of the Christian experience. Jesus said, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Look at Romans chapter 8. For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pain of childbirth together until now. And not only this, but also we ourselves, having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for our adoption as children, the redemption of our body. Now, if I'm not mistaken, Paul is saying that even those who have the first fruits of the Spirit still experience groaning within themselves. Do y'all see that? Our spirit has been redeemed, but our body's still waiting. Still stuck in this dark world, not yet redeemed. So what are these fruits of the Spirit that we possess even as we groan, even within our broken bodies? Well, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control, according to Galatians chapter 5. Did I leave anyone out? I sometimes miss one in there. So if we have a groaning agony in our present circumstance, that does not exclude the possibility of bearing the first fruits of the Spirit. So let me ask again. Can a person have both depression and joy? Well, if depression is a circumstance and joy is a fruit of the Spirit, then let's sub out a different circumstance and another fruit of the Spirit and play the same game, rephrase the same question. Can you have diabetes and kindness? Can you have arthritis and faithfulness? Can you have high cholesterol and love? Can they coexist in the same person? Can you have anxiety and patience? Of course you can. Of course you can. In fact, it would be very helpful to have patience in the midst of anxiety. Furthermore, depression may be a powerful tool in forming patience and abiding joy and bearing fruit. Of course, having joy, abiding in joy, trusting in God, these are part of a long and often difficult process. It's not like you just wake up and decide to be joyful in your depression or patient in your anxiety. But you can grow. You can grow in trust. You can grow in confidence. And you can have the comforting solace that regardless of your current health status, that you are in good hands, that you're in God's gracious care. I don't think God wants us all to be miserable, but I know that He's not opposed to discomfort. He's not opposed to affliction. He's not opposed to suffering if it might produce in us righteousness, patience, endurance, faithfulness. Look at this list of symptoms. Fatigue, irritability, mental cloudiness, lethargy, impaired judgment. Think about the unifying syndrome. What's the condition? Are these the symptoms of depression? Yeah. Wait, could these be the symptoms of thyroid disease? could these be the symptoms of acute hypoglycemia, low blood sugar? Okay. So what do all these things have in common? What do depression, thyroid disease, and hypoglycemia, what do they have in common? Chemical imbalance. With depression, it's chemicals like serotonin and dopamine. With thyroid disease, it's your thyroid hormone. With hypoglycemia, it's glucose and insulin. All of these are biochemical issues causing similar mental and emotional symptoms. So is depression chemical or is it spiritual? Is it physiologic? Is it biologic? Or is it something spiritual? Yes. It's chemical and spiritual. Right? The chemical is the how, but the spiritual, that's like the why and the what for. The chemical is just the explanation, but the spiritual is part of the reason. And also, while we're on the subject, while we're just, can you even imagine someone telling you that their child has just been diagnosed with juvenile diabetes and they're not going to go see a doctor? That they're just going to, keep it in the family, figure out how to deal with it? They're just going to pray about it. They're going to trust God to give the insulin, even though God allowed that lack of insulin in the first place. It's unfathomable. I'm not suggesting that they shouldn't be praying about it and they shouldn't be trusting God. But maybe they also need to get help. But people do this all the time with depression, don't they? Odds are they're going to try some very rational and hopefully compassionate approaches, but they'll just pray more. They'll deal with it. They won't ask for help. At least 60% of them won't seek any help. The problem with that approach is that mental health is basically irrational by definition. You can't just logic your way out of it. You can't just have a good idea and explain it and then it's gone. If it was logical, it wouldn't be inappropriate. You can't just tell a depressed child that their life really isn't that bad, so just turn that frown upside down. That might be logical, but depression is not typically a rational state. I want to read you a quote from Charles Spurgeon. Now, some of you may recognize that name, Charles Spurgeon, as a great theologian, and he certainly was. Some of you may also know that he struggled significantly with depression and anxiety. He even wrote about one particular Sunday where a panic episode kept him from preaching. His lesson was fully prepared. He was a devoted disciple of Christ, and he was also completely incapacitated by mental illness at times. Anyway, Charles Spurgeon wrote, "Do not think it unspiritual to remember that you have a body. The physician is often as needful as the minister." It is not unspiritual to remember that you have a body. In fact, God created that body. He also created the mind. And he allows the mind to become ill in the same way that he allows the body to become ill. God allows cancer. He allows bipolar disorder. He allows schizophrenia. He allows ADHD and concussions and seasonal allergies. And because he allows mental, physical, and spiritual illness, the physician is often as needful as the minister. So if you or your family has anxiety, that does not make you any less of a Christian than a preacher with asthma. Did you get that? Taking antidepressant medicine or seeing a counselor is just a way of acknowledging that our mind is often in need of special care, just as our body sometimes requires ibuprofen and our spirit needs the gospel. Half of my family takes antidepressants. Both of my kids have benefited from counseling. Don't let the stigma and don't let poor theology keep you from seeking the physician or the minister. This may also be a fair time to insert that there is a mind-body linkage. The two are fully enmeshed. So as much as we discuss various mental exercises and learn new coping skills, I would also be remiss if I didn't mention that things like diet and exercise are also important. Regular exercise, good sleep, those may be critically important in management of mental illness. So we don't want to overlook the basics. Exercise may actually be as good as antidepressants for milder depression. Anyway, moving on. Genesis 1:27 says that God created man in his own image. Now that can mean a lot of things. There are a lot of ways to understand that. I just want to point to one. God created man in his image. I want to point to the fact that God is a triune God. He is a Trinity. God consists of God the Father, who's the controlling head, the controlling mind, as well as Jesus, who's the physical, the corporeal manifestation, the flesh in body form. And then there's the Holy Spirit, who is the essence or the expression of God that pervades and indwells his creation. God made man in his own image of mind, body, and spirit. We also are a triune being. 1 Thessalonians 5, May the God of peace himself sanctify you entirely, and may your spirit and soul and body be preserved complete without blame at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. Do you notice here whenever he says entirely, he then defines entirely? What is entirely? Well, it includes your spirit, your soul, and your body. Hebrews 4:12, for the word of God is living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword, and piercing as far as the division of soul and spirit, of both joints and marrow, and able to judge the thoughts and intentions of the heart. So in both of these passages, we see the three distinct parts of man: spirit, soul, and body. Spirit, soul, and flesh. In the Hebrews passage, the author uses joints and marrow to represent flesh. So let's talk about these three things. Let's start with the body, okay? That's easy. The body, like I said, that's the flesh. That's the physical vessel for the spirit and the soul. Anybody struggling with this concept? Good, I didn't think you would. Okay, the other two, they're a little more nuanced. So bear with me. In order to understand this, you will have to use your mind, which is housed in the flesh of your brain, but is not the same thing as your brain. Your brain is flesh, but your mind is something more than that. In the Bible, the mind is often referred to as the soul. The soul, your soul. It's your mind, your thoughts, your emotions, your consciousness. In my neuroanatomy class in medical school, I held a brain in my hands. I could grasp it, I could dissect it, I could handle it. But that brain, it was unconscious. It was not emotive. It was not thoughtful. I've held a brain in my hands, but I've never grasped a soul. I've dissected a brain, but I've never dissected a mind. In fact, I'd say the closest thing I've had to holding a soul in my hands was not as a medical student, but as a parent. It's less tactile, but the formative work that we do is shaping the minds and souls of our children. So there's the flesh, there's the mind or the soul, and then there's the spirit. And sometimes we use soul and spirit interchangeably, but we shouldn't. The soul is not the same thing as the spirit. If it were the same thing, then the Word of God could not divide them. Remember, sharper than any two-edged sword, able to divide, piercing as far as division of soul and spirit. So if your soul is your mind, if that's your consciousness, just like how God is the controlling mind of the soul of the Trinity, then your spirit, that's your essence. It's your expression. It's your true identity. It's who you are. It's how you express yourself. Going back again to my medical training, we used to say that a child was asthmatic or that a person was diabetic. We would try to define them by their diagnosis, to give them the identity of diabetes or asthma. We don't do that anymore. Now we say that a person has diabetes or a person has asthma. We no longer let their physical ailment become their defining feature. Likewise, you may have asthma in your body, you may have anxiety in your soul, but your spiritual identity, who you really are, it remains as a beloved child of God. The real essence of what it means to be you remains joyful, firmly joyful with the abiding sense of being well off and well cared for. Another example, when I was a toddler, my mind and my body were undeveloped. But my identity was Jeffrey Mark Henderson. Actually, I had trouble with my R, so it was Jeffrey Mark Henderson. But either way, my identity was Jeffrey Mark Henderson. That's how I presented myself to the world. Now I'm older. My body has matured. My soul has matured. My body has changed. But my essence, my identity, that's unchanged. I'm still Jeffrey Mark Henderson. Now, I could change my name. I could go by Jeff instead of Jeffrey, but that wouldn't really change my essence. And regardless of circumstances in mind or body, my spirit, that remains fixed. That remains unmoved. Remains anchored in Christ. Also, when I was a young little Jeffrey, I really liked those tire swings. Y'all remember the tire swings, right? They'd have like 3 chains going up to that pivot point. What I loved about them is that you could swing like in 1,000 different directions, okay? This wasn't just back and forth. This was back and forth and up and down and side to side and spinning fast and spinning slow and getting tangled up. But they were always fixed at a single pivot point. Now, if the chains and the tire of that tire swing, if those things were to represent our mind and our body, then the fixed pivot point, that's our spirit. Our bodies change. Our mind vacillates, but our spirit anchors. And just as gravity demands that the pivot point is above the swing, at least most of the time, so also our spiritual identity is above our mind and our body. It supersedes those things. And that's why somebody's body can be in agony. And someone's mind can feel isolated and alone, and yet their spirit can remain unshaken. If you don't believe me, look at Jesus. Beaten, bruised, broken body, suffering physically. Agonizing soul in the garden, and then again on the cross with a despairing mind, feeling alone and forsaken. But never for a moment was he anything less than God, united and inseparable in spirit. Even though Jesus' tire swing, it was spinning out of control and his chains were getting all crossed up and twisted up, his anchor, man, that held fast. We have an anchor. We have an anchor that keeps our soul steadfast and sure while the billows roll, fastened to the rock which cannot move. So if your spirit is the essence of who you are, if it's your identity, then what do we do about those with an identity disorder? Michelle specifically brought up the issue of gender identity, gender nonconformity. So let's talk about that. Galatians 3. For you are all children of God through faith in Christ Jesus. For all of you who were immersed into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus. We are all children of God. That's our identity. That's who we are. We're not male or female or homosexual or heterosexual or transgender or cisgender or queer or questioning. We are children of God. That is our identity. The most important thing about me is that I am a child of God, because relationship takes preeminence. Your relational status as a child becomes the anchor, the pivot point of your tire swing. If you are a child of God, then whatever else you think you are, Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female, whatever you think you are, no longer matters. All those things become inferior. They subordinate themselves to your identity as a child of God. So perhaps we should stop defining people according to what we see. He's asthmatic. she's transgender. She's diabetic, he's depressed, she's gay. Maybe we should stop assigning identities to people. Maybe we should just lead them all into relationship with Christ and let him tell them who they are. If your son tells you that he's gay, maybe your job isn't to convince him that he's not. Maybe your job is to show him the unconditional love of God. Maybe your job is to tell him that you love him no matter what. Don't define him. And don't let him become defined by that one thing. But show him the love of God and tell him who he is. Let God tell him who he is, who he really is. If your daughter thinks that she's bisexual, don't accept that as her identity. She's more than that. She's more than her sexual preferences at a specific time in adolescence. Have pity for someone whose outlook is limited to only their sexual orientation. Help her, him, they understand a God who is bigger than that. A God who is loving, kind, gracious, patient. Take her to God. Let God tell her who she is. It may take some time, and it's probably going to be difficult, but it'll be better coming from him. And regardless of what we think we are when we come to him, he gets to assign our true identity. He can wipe away our past and set us on a new foundation. 2 Corinthians 5, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creature. The old things have passed away. Behold, new things have come. So here it comes. Here's that main point that I told you before. As parents, we need to keep repeating the phrase, I love you no matter what. I love you no matter what. I love you no matter what. Nothing can change my love for you. I am God's representative. I am his ambassador, and I will show you unconditional love. And if your child accepts that love, it can transform them. It can change them into their truest self. It can set their anchor in Christ, their identity in something bigger than gender or sexuality. Gender dysphoria, gender questioning, gender uncertainty and ambiguity. These are difficult concepts for me because I'm old, I'm from the past. Born not just in another century, but in another millennium. Times are different now. And we don't have to understand all the reasons for that, but we have to be extenders of God's grace. Especially in those areas that we don't understand, especially in those areas that seem foreign and strange to us. Another issue that seems to be on the rise in this millennium that I don't remember being as much of a thing when we were younger, although maybe it was there and I was just ignorant, is cutting. Cutting. Intentional self-injury. It's when teenagers inflict harm to their bodies as a manifestation of their perceived psychological distress. They intentionally inflict harm on their bodies as a manifestation of their perceived psychological distress. I'm going to stereotype just a little bit here, so forgive me, but a typical cutter would be an adolescent female who's driven. She's a high achiever with a little bit of a perfectionist streak. She's hard on herself. She has poor coping skills. And so usually in secret, she'll take a razor blade or maybe some scissors and make shallow cuts along the thighs or the arms, usually in places that can be covered by clothing, and therefore they can kind of remain hidden. During this season of cutting, there's usually also some social withdrawal, which is a common theme in mental illness, that kids don't want to come out of their room anymore. They're spending too much time in there. They don't want to go out with their friends. And again, in this situation, maybe starts wearing inappropriate clothes for the season. I don't mean inappropriate. I mean maybe covering stuff. They don't want to go to the pool or the river anymore because it would show some of the scars. So if you start to see that kind of pattern, consider the possibility of cutting. This is sort of the typical picture, but of course, young men can do it as well. And sometimes the cutting will be more obvious. It'll be on the wrists or the forearms, areas that are more visible. And as a rule, the more visible the cutting, the more obvious the cry for help. But it should be noted that cutting is not a suicide attempt. People who cut may also be suicidal, but the cutting itself is not a suicide attempt. Sometimes when they cut, that intentional injury, it can cause more serious problems than they expected. But most of the time it's just, we got to suture that up. They're not looking to kill themselves. They're not looking to bleed to death by slashing their wrists. They tend to make shallow cuts in non-lethal areas, just enough to cause pain. And why would they do that? Well, the people that I've talked to usually tell me one of two things. Either they have such intense emotional pain that the sensation of physical pain is preferred, or they're so emotionally numb that any sensation, even physical pain, is preferred to feeling nothing. So I'll say it again. Cutting is not a suicidal gesture, but it should be taken very seriously, because the mere fact that this seemed like a good solution, it tells us that that child is in marked emotional distress and they have very poor coping skills. Cutting is not usually attention-seeking, but if you discover it, it should definitely get your attention. If you discover that your child is cutting, you don't need to panic. You don't need to rush them off to the emergency room or the psych hospital, but please, please, please don't brush it off. It's not just some fad that they're trying to get in on. It's not just like an emo black nail polish after-school special kind of thing. Cutting should get your attention. If your child's best coping mechanism is to inflict bodily harm, that is a big, big red flag. It's not done for attention. One of the main symptoms is secrecy, but the discovery of cutting, if handled correctly, can be a relief. Now, if you can handle it incorrectly, you can accuse them and make them feel guilty and, give them a big basket of shame and insist that we're going to do body checks to make sure that you're not doing any more cutting. And if you do that, you may be able to suppress some of the cutting, but you're not really helping. You can suppress some of the symptoms, but you're not addressing the cause. Because remember, these children are suffering, isolated, and unequipped to manage their emotional state. So what do? We acknowledge their pain. I am so sorry. I didn't realize how bad you felt. We want to re-engage. Something as simple as eye contact and expressions of love and support, not shame, but love and support. I want to help you. We're going to get through this together. You're going to get better. I'm with you. And we want to recognize the seriousness of the outcry. We want to help them develop new coping skills that maybe are helpful instead of harmful. As parents, you are the primary counselors for your children. But I really can't imagine a situation where a child is injuring himself or herself and they don't also need professional counselor, psychologist, therapist. Do not think it unspiritual to get help. I was also asked to speak a little bit about suicide. And I guess we've touched on that a little bit, but I'd like to establish the cause of suicide, that suicide is not necessarily the result of depression, anxiety, or mental illness. There are plenty of people with depression and anxiety who do not choose to take their own lives. Suicide is the culmination of loneliness and hopelessness. It's the culmination of loneliness and hopelessness. This upcoming generation is more connected than ever through iPhones, internet, social media. And they're also more lonely and socially isolated than perhaps any generation in history. Even before COVID, but especially now. What I mean is that most of them are already predisposed to suicide because of loneliness. They already have that as a predisposing factor. But to think that death is the best option does not just require loneliness, but also hopelessness. Also hopelessness. I don't want to oversimplify this, but if I could recommend one thing for suicide prevention, it would be for everyone to know the 23rd Psalm. And I don't just mean memorize it, I mean understand it, own it, know it in the deepest sense. The Lord is my shepherd. I'm not alone. I have someone on my team. I lack for nothing. I'm well cared for. This relationship is sufficient. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He makes me rest. He makes me put down the glass. He leads me beside quiet waters. He gets me outside. He takes me on a nature walk. He equips me with coping skills. He restores my soul. He restores my mind. He gives me better thoughts and better emotions. He guides me in paths of righteousness for His name's sake, for a higher purpose. He gives my life meaning. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. I'm never alone. I'm never hopeless. Even in the worst situation, my spiritual anchor is in you. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You use your tools for my benefit. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. I can be content in any situation. I can enjoy a meal in the midst of scoffers, bullies, and those who oppose me because I bear no ill will against them. I do not seek recrimination. I just want to join them for a feast. My cup overflows in a good way, not in a stressed out, overwhelmed way. Surely goodness and loving kindness and all the other fruits of the Spirit will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell securely in the house of the Lord for all eternity, starting now, not when I die, but while I still live. And I'm not sure that it's possible to know and understand and embrace the 23rd Psalm and still feel lonely or hopeless. Of course, you can memorize the 23rd Psalm and still want to take your own life. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about really knowing that intimate kind of knowledge where you own the knowledge in your deepest parts. The kind of knowing where you're confident in your shepherd, confident in His goodness, assured of His presence, strengthened by the hope that He provides, even though the circumstances around you may be horrible. You're still in good hands. It also helps to have a parent who knows and understands and models and teaches these beliefs. And maybe all of this is why David's Psalms, his Psalms of despair, they always end with a turn. They end with a ray of hope, a reminder that the Lord is our shepherd, our rock, our fortress in whom we take refuge, our shield, our defender, our deliverer, our bounty, our companion, our comforter. Maybe we can prevent a few suicides by introducing the lonely and hopeless to a good and beautiful God who cares about them personally, even in the midst of those horrible situations. 2 Corinthians 4. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not despairing. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. Always carrying in the body the dying of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our body. If you want to prevent suicide, be a minister of hope. Especially for your family. Watch your language, watch your attitude. Don't always be complaining. It's fine to acknowledge that bad things happen in life, but then demonstrate the hope that you have, the comfort that you have, the hope that we aren't here just to walk an easy path to heaven. We're here to be conformed to the image of Christ. That process may be difficult. It certainly was for Christ, but it's also filled with the blessings of hope that we are well off because we're in good hands. And of course, we don't neglect the behavioral or the biochemical issues as we work with counselors and physicians. Also, a good way to prevent suicide and to promote mental health in general, you need to know your kids' friends. You need to know your kids' friends. Monitor friendships. Have frank conversations about those who have a negative influence. Bad company corrupts good character, 1 Corinthians 15:33. Bad company corrupts good character. And there are some toxic friendships that will drag our beloved children into the mud. Of course, we want our children to be salt and light in this dark and rotten world. We want them to be able to love those who are in desperate need of Christ's love. We want them to be lifeguards, but a drowning man will pull others down with him, even if they're trying to help. You have to be a strong swimmer to be a lifeguard. Are you following my analogy here? That some of our children, they're not ready to become lifeguards yet. They may be too weak for some friendships right now. You may need to have a difficult and honest conversation, and you may need to start changing their social network. Keep them in the shallow end just a little bit longer until they're stronger swimmers. My wife and I had to have that conversation with our daughter when she was in high school. She's now 20 years old and has a more defined character, and she's good now, but at the time she was too easily influenced, and we had to meddle with her social circle. Keep her friends from dragging her down. She didn't love that conversation. One more way to help prevent suicide is simply to ask. People are afraid to ask. They're afraid to ask it. Have you thought about hurting yourself? Have you considered killing yourself? How much do you really want to live? Seems like an ugly thing, an intrusive thing to ask. The fact of the matter is, most teenagers have thought about it. I don't know about you, I thought about it when I was a teenager. Fortunately, most of them, including me, after thinking, we decide, you know what, that's not a very good idea. Right? That's fine. That's logical. There's nothing wrong with thinking, life stinks, I'd be better off dead. No, wait, never mind. It's called brainstorming. There's nothing wrong with that. What's not normal is to think, I should kill myself. Oh, wait, yeah, that's it. That will solve all my problems. I need to do that, and here's how I'm going to do that. We call that suicidal ideation. It's not just thinking about it. It's not just brainstorming. It's where you think that it's a great solution to your problems. So brainstorming as a possible solution is normal. That's readily dismissed, but suicidal ideation is not normal. Thinking that death is a good coping strategy means that the logic train has left the station. And the only way to know where teenagers are at in that process is to ask. Numerous studies have definitively proven that asking about suicidality does not plant ideas. It doesn't increase the future likelihood of suicidal attempts. Many students report being relieved that they're finally able to talk about that thing that was kind of a dark secret. They're relieved that someone cared enough to ask a difficult and potentially ugly question. You have to love your students enough to ask tough questions. We have to love our children enough to ask tough questions and to have difficult conversations. I need to wrap this up, so let me try to summarize here. Talk, love, be involved, lead to Christ. Talk. Start having those difficult conversations. It's better now than later, and there may come a point when it's too late, and I'm not trying to be dramatic. I'm just trying to be real. If there's a conversation that you know you need to have, but you're avoiding it just because you don't want to, because it's uncomfortable, grow up, be the adult, have the conversation. Now, if you're not having that conversation because you're not sure how, because you're not adequately equipped, that's fine. Get help. Ask for help. We're here to help you. It's why we're here. But talk. Love. Practice unconditional love. Learn and repeat the phrase, I love you no matter what. Become reflexive with it. Use it anytime you don't know what else to say. I love you no matter what. And be involved. Stay involved. Meddle in your child's life. Ask probing questions. Monitor friendships. I tell students all the time that outside of car accidents, most of the time when young people are seriously injured or killed, arrested, suspended, it's because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong people. How do you avoid that? Well, you find the right people. Stop asking them if they want to go to church or student ministries or camp retreats or whatever. Just take them. You can orchestrate friendships without being a helicopter. It's okay to meddle. It's okay to interfere. It is your right as a parent and maybe even your obligation. Don't apologize for caring. Be involved. Talk. Love. Be involved. Lead to Christ. We should always be leading our children toward Christ. Let their identity come from Him as His child. We always lead them to Christ. We might also need to lead them to a counselor, a pastor, or a doctor, but more than anything, we keep pointing them back to Christ. We remind them of His love, and we pray that they be filled with His hope. If y'all will join me in prayer, then we'll move on to questions. Dear God, our Father, our perfect parent, we ask that the message received tonight will begin a process of healing for someone. I ask that my words will be received in the spirit that they were intended, that they be understood correctly, and that no one will be further injured because I've confused or misspoken or given bad advice. Please guide our discussion as we continue into the time of questions. Please provide the answers that you have prepared for us. Thank you for your love, patience, and equipping as we patiently love and equip our children. Amen.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Now, some of you who had to come in a little bit later, we are going to do a Q&A time, and this is an opportunity for you to ask Jeff anything and everything, anything that came up in your thoughts while he was talking. Maybe you came with questions already, or maybe he didn't address something, but this is a safe place for you to ask questions, and I know it might be uncomfortable for you, so if it is, that's okay. We can stay after and talk. You can email us, call us later, or you can write down your question, hand it to me, and I can even ask it. Because if it's on your mind, it probably is on the mind of another parent in the room. Also want to let you all know that this is being recorded. So if you don't want to share your question out loud because you don't want it to be recorded or you don't want your voice to be heard, I just want to make sure you guys know that. So I personally have some questions, but I'm not going to ask them yet. If one of you has a question, we'll go ahead and start. And we want you to use the mic so that everybody can hear you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
As a parent, loving is easy for me, for us. What is not so easy with two girls, 11 and 8, is knowing when to push, when to parent hard, and when to back off. To give you some context to my question, advanced PE versus regular PE, it sounds really stupid, I know, but for my 11-year-old, it's a big deal. And so I think back about how my father raised me, and the man that I am today involved tough things. I had to go through some tough things that I didn't want to do. But as a parent, it breaks my heart. It breaks our heart. So I'm wondering whether or not you can touch upon that. Loving is first. Leading to Christ is obviously first. But then there's that middle ground of like parenting that I just don't know exactly, where I stand. And lastly, before I give the mic, you started by defining for us what depression is, roughly. Before you talked about anxiety and I beg your pardon, you talked about stress before you define depression and anxiety. And I'm wondering whether or not that's because, clinically speaking, someone without the skills to cope with stress, whether that can lead to depression and anxiety, whether or not there's a clinical relation there. Thank you.
Sure. So let's start with that. I think someone who has poor coping skills, it may progress because of, like I was saying, that fatigue of holding on to the stress. Eventually it wears you down, just as life circumstances can wear you down. we will sometimes see people go through depressive phases because of things that are happening in their life. Death of a loved one, having to stay home and do online education because they're scared about this pandemic. There are a lot of situational factors that add to that. Now, that we need to be careful to separate these two ideas, though, that while the inability to cope can lead to bigger mental issues, things that become larger, whereas if they had developed coping mechanisms, maybe it would have de-escalated. There are still people that have all the coping skills that they need and still have, a biochemical issue. Okay, and so I think part of the idea there is that if you're coming to me and saying, hey, my kid is super anxious, what do we do? Medication is not step one, right? Medication is step 3 or step 4. We talk about, helping your kid develop coping mechanisms. We talk about you being their counselor. We talk about you maybe needing counseling to know how to help them. Then we talk about them maybe needing to see a counselor. And then we talk about medicine, right? So I think the idea there is that that's just a really simple place for us to start. Now, going back to the question about when do I push my child and when do I pull back, right? Unfortunately, there's not an answer for that because you have to become the expert in your child and you can't parent all of your children the same. We had to teach our kids that we're not going to be fair in the way that we parent you. We're not going to parent one the same as the other because y'all have very different needs. Y'all have very different personalities. The example that immediately comes to mind is that my daughter, when we would take her in for immunizations, we would not tell her she was getting shots because she would freak out for an hour before the shots, and then when she got them, it was like no big deal. But my son, we couldn't surprise him. We had to prepare him 3 days in advance that you're going to get shots, and if he knew what to expect, he was okay with it. But my daughter, she was going to freak out, so it was better to wait until the last minute. And I know that doesn't tell you whether to push your kid into advanced PE or whether to go into join club soccer. It doesn't give you that. But as you become an expert on your children, and frankly, some of this is trial and error, right? And fortunately, even though we know we're going to get it wrong, God is bigger than our parenting skills. And so sometimes we're like, man, I think I'm screwing this up, but God, you got it. And so we keep seeking his will. We keep seeking what's best for them, and we do our best. And if you find yourself really in a bind, sometimes it helps to reach out to some of our resources and say, Sam, I need to sit down and talk with you about, I'm not real sure. I'm not sure how to parent my child right now. And that's, again, I don't see that as any different than if your child's struggling to read and you say, we're going to work with the reading specialist to get through this dyslexia thing. I think there are times that we say, as a parent, I'm doing all right, but I need some specific advice on this child. But general advice, I'm sorry. I don't think there's a simple solution for that. The good news is if you're being intentional about it and you're being thoughtful and you're being loving, those things do have a way of working themselves out, but that doesn't make the process any easier. Okay.
Matt and I were going to race.
So I'm kind of on the thoughts of my youngest son. He's 9, and noticed in the past year or so with some changes going on in our family, he's developed some anxiety. And first that came out as anger. All those things were, counseling and all that. What are your thoughts or research? Have you looked into CBD? Those are kind of out there, and it's kind of like when you look up stress management, you have over 500,000 reviews on it or whichever. So there's so much out there. It's hard when you don't want to go to I don't know, it's still in a way a medication. It's still medicating. But when we go into medications and things like that.
Yeah, and 3 things kind of come to mind. The first thing is you mentioned it comes out as anger, and that's a more common response from guys than from girls. Doesn't mean that girls don't get angry when they're depressed or anxious, but with guys, again, that's the whole idea of depression is not necessarily sadness. Sometimes depression is anger or withdrawal or aggression or what have you. The second thing is what I love about an anxious or depressed 9-year-old is that they're going to get better. Okay, their mind is still maturing. You know, when we're dealing with a depressed or anxious 30-year-old, the prognosis isn't as good because their brains are set, right? I'm not saying that they can't get better. I'm saying you have a very plastic, a very pliable mind, and that's an amazing opportunity, especially for those of you who have like a history of mental illness that runs in the family. The earlier you recognize it, the earlier you intervene, whether that's behavioral or chemical, that intervention makes a bigger difference at an earlier age. So it's really cool that he's probably going to outgrow this because you're going to be working with him from a young age. But if you sit back and don't work with him because you think he'll just outgrow this, then sometimes you get set in those patterns. But then the third part of that was asking about CBD. That's a hard one. The first part of that is I don't think that chemical interventions should ever replace the behavioral interventions. We don't want to teach him that if you will take this substance, then it will make you feel better, because that keeps him from learning how to problem solve and how to cope. It's abdicating that responsibility, which I don't think is the right thing. But also, it may, it may predispose him to seek substances as the solution for his problem. And that's why, as we were saying, that's not our first response, right? I have a general rule that I don't prescribe medicine to anyone who's not already seeing a counselor or engaged in counseling. There are some exceptions to that, but in general, we walk through those steps. But if you're going through those steps and you're supporting him and you're working with counselors and you're working as his parent and you're helping him develop those stress management and all of those things, I would say that CBD is a reasonable thing. However, we don't have established dosing. And there's remarkable inconsistency across various brands and different derivations that come from different roots. When I say roots, I mean different buds, but from different types. And so it becomes very difficult to give any real advice on what to do with CBD. I hate to leave it there, but I would have the same conversation if you were in my office to say there might be some benefit to it, but I'm not sure how to guide you through that process. That's not what I do. I'm not the CBD guy. Is that?
No,
okay,
that's really good.
Okay.
Is it on still?
I don't think so.
No, it's really good. And I like how you had mentioned about a substance. Like, I don't. That's one thing that I struggle with too.
Mm-hmm.
Just here, take this, and then we're gonna feel better. Like that definitely lead to so much more.
Yes. So she was saying we don't want to just become dependent on a substance to say, here, take this and you'll feel better. But even with that, there's a little bit of a balance that sometimes being proactive with milder chemicals that change over time is better than waiting until a person gets to a terrible state and then the medicine becomes like their savior. Right? So with all of these things, there's a lot of nuance, and that's where, again, you're working with your team. You're working with, parent peer groups. You're working with your counselors. You're working with your physician. And again, you may take him to his doctor, and he has a different answer for you about CBD. He's like, oh, yeah, I got a guy that'll hook you up, and I trust his stuff, and here's exactly the dosing. But I can't make a recommendation about that because it's kind of complicated.
Anyone else?
In blended family scenarios where one side of the co-parenting has different beliefs about mental health and when to intervene and how to interpret child's behavior versus the other side of the co-parenting scenario, how do we best teach our kids to have those healthy coping mechanisms when they may be in very direct opposition of the other co-parenting equation without causing confusion or making a child feel as if they need to take a side or as if one parent is right and the other is wrong. How do we do that in a gracious way to help our kids with their mental health and their coping?
Can you give me a ballpark on age? Are we talking about this big or this big?
9.
Okay. Yeah. So the first thing is, you don't ever want to destroy a child's relationship with their parent. Parents have the option to destroy that relationship, but we're not going to do it for them. Okay. So even if you and X don't get along, you still, we're doing everything we can to foster that relationship because we understand that that's important in the life of a child. There certainly are times to have boundaries on those things, but it sounds like you've got your head around those. I think this is one of those things that you just have to do your best when they're under your care. And over time, we equip them with some of the skills that they can use when they are not under your care. And also, we debrief when they return. Okay, so whenever they come back to your house after the weekend or after, the summer break or whatever, and they come back, you talk to them about, hey, how did things go? Where did you struggle? Where was it good? How can we make that better in the future? The next time you find yourself in that situation. And what we're doing there is not solving their problems for them, but we're doing collaborative problem solving. We're saying, something that sometimes helps me in that situation is this. What would you think about that? Do you think that would be helpful? Okay, well, imagine you're in that situation again. What could you do about that? Honestly, we do the same thing with eating. They'll be with one parent and it's all healthy eating. They'll go to the other parent and it's nothing but junk food, right? And eventually they get to an age where they're choosing for themselves. 9 is difficult. Right? 9 is difficult because they're going to run roughshod over whatever they can get away with. They don't have those natural bumpers on their lane. And so we do our best to get them kind of moving the right direction, knowing that, they're going to veer off and then we're going to have to bump them back. But it's a whole lot better to do as much as we can, gaining momentum moving forward here, so that even if they get bumped off, off track by that co-parent. Also, again, sound like a broken record, but sometimes it's helpful if that person is willing to engage in family therapy and sit down and talk through some of these things and not from a standpoint of, okay, I'm doing everything right, you're screwing everything up, we're going to fix you, but more from a standpoint of, hey, can we come together and just talk about what we're doing with this kid? Okay, because if we can't be on the same page about that, it's going to be a lot more difficult for him or her. But yeah, that's a tough one, and it's going to need a lot of support.
We lost a child to suicide 3 years ago, and we have a 20-year-old and a 12-year-old. The 12-year-old was 8 years old at that time, and from day one, we obviously talked about the situation, but since then he will not talk about it, and I've tried, but I don't know if it may be too difficult for him, but I also want to teach him that it's okay, to, get these emotions out, and so we can help him. I've taken him to counseling, and the counselors have shared with me that he worries about me, and that's why he doesn't share. But I've given him permission, like, baby, it's okay, mama's gonna get sad, mama's gonna have a hard day, but I need you to tell me how you're feeling. But still, he'll have his sad days, because they share rooms, but he won't talk about it.
I'm very sorry. And we should also mention that while there are some things that can help prevent suicide, some are just unpreventable. They're going to happen. okay? And when that happens, it's a tragedy and it's awful, but some people, we just can't stop that, okay? And again, it doesn't make us irredeemable. It doesn't put him beyond God's love and grace, and I'm very sorry that y'all have had to live through that. I think one of the things that we have to convey to our children is that we are sponges for stress and anger and emotions and whatever else, okay? Mama's tough. Bring it to me. You got something that's bothering you, it is my job as a parent to take that and help you with that. And if I get stressed and overwhelmed by it, if I am too emotional about it, I'll go seek help for myself, but you bring everything to me. I am tough enough and I can take this. Don't you worry about Mama. Mama will take care of, she's here to take care of you. And that's one of the things that is probably going to take some time for him to come around on. But also, again, that's where sometimes having another person that they don't feel like they're burdening, because kids can be very sensitive to this. And again, this doesn't have to be a counselor. I know we keep going back to counseling. This could be, Uncle Johnny. If Uncle Johnny's a good guy, okay, it needs to be somebody we trusted. It could be, maybe a small group leader in their Bible class. It could be, a scoutmaster. It could be a soccer coach. It could be someone else, but it needs to be someone that we trust, and it needs to be someone that's having that specific conversation. Okay, it's not just, hey, check in on him and make sure he's doing okay. It's, hey, we're going to sit down and we're going to have some breakfast tacos, and I want you to tell me what's going on, and how that sounds like you've been through some really sucky stuff, and I'm so sorry, and I'm here for you, and your mama can handle it, and so forth. But sometimes having that disinterested third party, somebody that they don't feel bad about burdening, can be a good outlet. But you keep having the conversation, and hopefully they'll be able to open up about that some, because it's impossible to go through that and be unaffected. We have no idea how they're going to be affected, but they will be affected, and it helps to just kind of know where you're at on that. And sometimes we have to work through a surrogate to get there. So a good family friend, a trusted family member, a grandpa, whatever. It depends on your support network. But yeah, I'm really sorry.
Anybody? Anyone else?
Any advice for a parent who does try to talk to their child and be involved and love on them, and that child says to you multiple times, you don't understand. You don't know what it's like. And despite my saying, you're probably right, I don't understand, they don't open up. Any words of advice?
Yeah, acknowledging, like you said, acknowledging the fact that I don't understand. I don't understand what it's like to be a 9-year-old in 2021. I don't understand what it's like to be a 15-year-old in 2022. I have no idea what that experience is like. And so I think the first thing, like you said, is just acknowledging, yeah, I don't understand. Can you help me understand? Because I care about you, because I love you, I want to be involved in this process. And no, I'm not going to leave you alone. Okay, that's when we talk about collaborative problem solving. Leave me alone. That's not a solution. Okay, if you need some time to think about how, but that's part of it is help me understand. The other thing is there's two different types of questions in this realm. One is thinking questions and one is feeling questions. And so there's the idea of, okay, I can't understand this. I can't think through this. I can't experience it. Can you tell me what it feels like? Okay, does it feel lonely or does it feel irritable? Right? Does it feel lost Does it feel hopeless? Does it feel sad? Does it feel, and sometimes as you walk through the idea of kind of those feeling questions versus other people will respond a little bit better to thinking questions, and you can kind of mix it up until you sort of, so, okay, you had a bad day. What do you think about that? Or why do you think that happened? Or, okay, you feel sad. Why do you think you feel sad? Versus, well, life just sucks. Okay, well, how does that feel when life sucks? So you see what I'm saying? That we kind of go back and forth, and we just kind of keep probing. And there is a point where you can only help a person so far, right? That we can't force someone to open up and talk to us. Just like when our kids were younger, we couldn't force them to eat their green beans. Okay? We could manipulate the situation and incentivize the green beans, but we were not going to drop a nose tube and start shoving green beans into their stomach. That was not an option for us. So what we do is over time and through a gradual process, hopefully we get our kids eating their green beans, but there are some kids that are never going to eat green beans no matter what we do. And we just have to keep working around the edges and doing what we can to get other vegetables or fruits or vitamins or whatever into them. And I think in this situation, you keep trying different tacts, you keep trying different approaches, and sometimes we'll incentivize and disincentivize behavior and say, hey, you want to go to that thing? You want to go out with your friends? You want to see that movie? That's cool. Talk to me for a few minutes. Tell me what you're feeling, all right? Because if not, the answer is no, because I've got the car keys, okay? So, you can, there are things that you can earn. And you know what? Right now, I'm not sure that I trust you enough to go out with those friends. We need to work on a little bit of trust. And if you want to go out with them or if you want to do those things, then we need to start working on this relationship a little bit, because you can't close me out and continue to do everything that you're wanting to do. And so there are ways to structure around that. And like I said, there are people that can help you if you're just completely lost in that. But I would say different types of questioning, different types of incentives, and just keep trying different approaches, just like when the kids were, picky eaters.
Okay, so my question is about the personality versus the diagnosis that you talked about. And I'm on high alert. This is about 10-year-old boy because mental illness runs in the family, long history of it on both sides. So, there's a part and a mom that's like, maybe we should go see a counselor. Is it just his personality? He's just not, doesn't seem like a really super happy kid, or is it okay? And is there a way to check in with him, a question to ask to kind of see, would you be open to, how are you feeling? I mean, I don't even know what to ask a 10-year-old to check in.
There are some pretty good books out there that are written for, kids, just talking about emotions, anxiety, depression, some of those things. And sometimes actually starting with an age-appropriate book and then having a conversation. What did you think about that book? Do you identify with the sad hippopotamus? Whatever it is. And sometimes that, I realize that may be a little young for a 10-year-old, but you get what I'm saying. That sometimes, books can open the door for that. There's some great YouTube videos for kids and emotions. I haven't met many 10-year-olds that weren't willing to sit down and watch a few YouTube videos and then having a follow-up conversation on that, because sometimes the problem there is that they don't have the vocabulary to express what they're actually feeling. But whenever they see it played out, then you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I was more like, the rhinoceros than the hippopotamus, because the rhinoceros was angry and the hippopotamus was sad, and so sometimes that helps give the tools. That's actually what play therapists do as well, that they're engaging the kids using a different form of communication, whether that's art or sand tables or dolls or whatever. They're trying to kind of crack that nut a little bit and say, okay, well, what's actually going on underneath the surface? Why? Because we can all see what's going on, but what we really want to know is not what's going on, but why is it happening? You know, how much do I need to be concerned about this? Again, I'd say the fact that you are on high alert is a very good thing. I would maybe start with books and YouTube videos. And again, if you still feel like you're striking out, this is a situation where you might want to go see a child psychologist because, okay, so here, I'm a doctor, which means I'm the medicine guy, okay? I'm not the behavioral specialist. I know things about behavior, but I'm not the counselor. And sometimes it helps to say, okay, here's kind of what we're seeing, here's kind of what we're thinking, here's what I've been able to find from probing, you know, what do I do next? And so not necessarily taking him to a counselor, but you going to see a counselor to figure out how to work some of that stuff out. But there are some tools and resources beforehand. There's also inventories. There's one called, I think it's called Scared. It has to do with looking for childhood anxiety and depressive symptoms. There's something called the PSC-17, which is the Pediatric Symptom Checklist. And those are things that are open access online. Those are questionnaires that you would fill out as parents, like what kind of behaviors do I see? And then you total it up and you say, okay, these are low-level concerns versus higher level, in which case you might want to go talk to a doctor or a counselor. PSC-17 and SCARED, S-C-A-R-E-D, and I forget exactly what it stands for. Oh, yeah. I would look for pre-adolescent and then whatever symptom you're curious about. Depression, opposition, anxiety, and obviously watch it beforehand. You know, we're not just going to say pre-adolescent anxiety and then sit him down and let him watch everything that pops up. But if you screen it beforehand, you'll be like, you know what, I think he would connect with this because this one's more about animals and this one's more about sports. And so, you know, he likes animals more than he cares about football. So yeah, you can look at some of those kinds of things. And I might be able to find like some specific sites, and none of them are immediately coming to mind, but like child psychiatry type websites that have those as part of it. I want to say the one that I think about is called Bright Futures, which is done by the American Academy of Pediatrics. I think that it has some psychiatric modules in it, but I would need to look all that up before I could say with certainty. Okay, yeah. I think, yeah.
So this question is a little bit different, but I feel like it probably will help some other people in different ways. How do you help a typical child or children cope with a child with special needs behavior? We had a recent diagnosis of, it's almost been a year, and our 6-year-old, who will be 7 soon, is getting anxious with our 5-year-old's behavioral trends.
Well, the first thing is everything else we've said still applies. It's one of those situations where you can't remove the stressor, right? You have to learn how to cope with the stressor. But there are also situations where you figure out times to get breaks. You know, just like as parents, sometimes you're like, you know what, I got to step away just a little bit because this is getting to be too much for me. That's especially difficult for a child, that they have their alone time with mom, or they have their playtime, you know, at the neighbors where they can get away from that stressor and get a little bit of relief. But then everything else that we've said about, you know, learning how to cope, learning how to deal, working with counselors, working through stress management strategies, all those same things still apply. Kids tend to mimic what they see. And so the more patient that we are and the way that we interact with the special needs child will also guide the neurotypical child. That doesn't mean they get it right away. Obviously, it's a process, but always checking, how we're doing and what we're modeling for our children becomes super important as well. Yeah, that's a difficult one because again, you tend to not have a break. It's that constant kind of nagging stressor where you can't ever completely put down the glass of water. So we learn ways to kind of move away from that, to take breaks. And we also encourage those things that are really good for the kids. So a common idea there would be like, go for a walk outside, right? Like that's a really good one for me. Often like at lunchtime, I'll just walk away from the clinic and I'll just walk around outside for a little while. That's it. And if we know that that's something that's good for our neurotypical child, then we say, you know what? Your new chore is going to be walking the dog. You walk the dog every day because we know that that's going to get him or her outside, which is a good stress reliever for them. Or maybe it's not that. Maybe it's art that, we got to make sure that we're drawing pictures every day, or that you're listening to your music, or that you're playing your music, or that you're doing whatever those stress relievers are, which is sometimes difficult because that gives you one other thing that you have to be doing. It's enough that you have to take care of your special needs child, and then you've got this thing. But at the same time, as you carve out some of the time and that becomes part of the routine, you may see a de-escalation of the irritation and the manifestation of those chronic stress symptoms.
That's great. I have one more question. That's
Yeah.
kind of a follow-up to that. So if we definitely are working on different ways to do that. But another question I have that kind of goes together is is there a certain way that you should approach the children that are typical or not having anxiety or depression to let them know that the sibling is different or the sibling is coping with something different so that they can either be a support or they can use that time to know like, okay, this is happening. I need a break myself. I can go to my room. Is there a way to approach that that's better than another?
I don't think there's a specific way because, again, that goes back to the specifics of your child, their age, their understanding of what's going on, how severe the condition is. There are a lot of things that go into that. I think the important thing is that you have the conversation, not just one time, but you have the conversation 1,000 times, and you check in and say, hey, what we're doing, is that working? Do you have other questions? You know what, there's some stuff we still don't know that we're still learning about, and as we, and it's an ongoing conversation. But I wouldn't say that there's a specific way to have that. I will say one of the best ways to have uncomfortable conversations is to hop in the car. Where, you turn off the radio and you flip up the TV screen and all that, and you talk to kids while you're driving and say, something I was thinking about. So it's not like I'm coming into your room and we're going to sit down and we're going to talk about this thing and we're going to sort it out right now. But instead it's, hey, we're going to be at HEB in 10 minutes, okay? But this is not a one-time conversation. And so sometimes it helps just to load kids up and take them for a little ride and talk to them about things while you're out running errands. And then when you stop at HEB, you pause the conversation, you get back in the car to come home, and you pick the conversation. Did you have any other questions about that? But it's more, it's not that there's a specific way to have the conversation. It's more that it has to be an ongoing conversation. Also, it's 6 o'clock, which means I'm sorry. Kept you too long.
That's okay. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you.